a dropout, with a classified file the Pentagon still won't release. That's how the story starts. Not with a diploma, not with a ceremony, with a girl sitting in the back of a government van at 19 years old, signing her name on a document that didn't officially exist, agreeing to do work that officially wasn't happening for people who officially weren't there. Her name was Josephine Mwangi. Most people who knew her then, the ones still alive anyway, called her Jo. She grew up in Baltimore. Sandtown, Winchester, the part of the city the tourism board doesn't put on the brochures. Her mother, Esther, worked double shifts at Johns Hopkins in the laundry department for 11 years before her knees gave out. Her father left when Jo was 6 and sent money twice, then stopped. She had a younger brother named Emeka who was good at drawing and terrible at staying out of trouble. And she spent most of her teenage years being the thing that stood between him and every bad decision he was about to make. She was the one who walked him to school. She was the one who waited outside the corner store when his friends went in for reasons she didn't ask about. She was the one who pulled him out of the park behind Gilmer Street at 11:30 on a Tuesday when she had a math test the next morning and he was supposed to be home 3 hours ago. She wasn't supposed to be remarkable. That's the thing you have to understand. Nothing about Sandtown, Winchester in the early 2000s suggested to anyone that remarkable was even an option. The school was underfunded. The teachers were overworked. The textbooks were 12 years old and missing pages. Jo figured this out in 7th grade when she realized her science book still referred to Pluto as a planet and listed the population of the Soviet Union. But she was fast, unnaturally fast, and she could see things before they happened. Not in a supernatural way, in the way that certain people are wired to read space and motion and trajectory like it's a language everyone else forgot to learn. She noticed it first in gym class, then in the street, then in the moments when something was about to go wrong and her body was already moving before her brain finished the sentence. A recruiter named Staff Sergeant Dennis Achebe came to her high school her junior year. He sat at a folding table in the gymnasium with a banner that looked like it had been printed in 2004 and never updated, and most of the students walked past him without stopping. Jo stopped. Not because she'd always dreamed of the military. She stopped because she was doing the math in her head. Tuition she didn't have, scholarships that didn't guarantee anything. Emeka still 2 years from finishing school, her mother's knees getting worse, and the numbers kept coming out the same way. She signed the papers 8 months later. What happened in the 5 years after that is mostly redacted. What is documented in the records that do exist is that Private Josephine Mwangi entered basic training and finished in the top 3% of her class. That she was identified for a specialized assessment program, that she was transferred twice to locations that are listed in her file only by code designation, that by 23 she had more operational hours in hostile environments than most soldiers accumulate in a full career. She came home at 24 with an honorable discharge, a limp that lasted 8 months, 3 citations she couldn't show anyone, and a GI Bill she didn't know how to use. She spent 6 months in her mother's apartment on Prestman Street. Esther fed her. Didn't ask questions. Emeka was working at a print shop in Fells Point by then, had a daughter on the way, was doing everything right. Jo slept a lot, went to the grocery store at 2 in the morning when it was empty, sat on the back steps at night and watched the alley and didn't think about much. Then she decided to go to college. The University of Maryland's Department of Kinesiology and Applied Human Performance wasn't somewhere most people ended up by accident. You applied, you submitted a portfolio, you went through an interview process that was designed to filter out anyone who wasn't serious. Jo applied, submitted her transcripts from before the service, which were good, because she had always been good at school when she had the materials to work with, and a personal statement she rewrote 9 times, and a set of recommendations from 2 people whose names and titles she was not allowed to disclose in full, but whose letters, when they arrived, made the admissions committee pause. She got in. Full funding through the GI Bill plus a departmental scholarship she didn't apply for. Someone put her name on it. She started in January, 25 years old, sitting in classrooms with 19-year-olds who'd come straight from high school, who'd never had a job, who complained about dining hall food and parking permits, and group project partners who didn't contribute. Jo sat in the back, took notes, didn't say much. She liked the coursework. She was good at it, the anatomy, the biomechanics, the physiology. Things she'd learned in the field through necessity, she was now learning the formal language for. She could feel herself getting sharper, filling in gaps she hadn't known were there. The problem was Dr. Elliot Marsh. Marsh ran the graduate seminar on advanced performance assessment that Jo was placed in as part of an accelerated track, a concession to her age and background that the department had approved before she arrived. He was 57 years old, tenured since 1998, and had authored a textbook that was still used in 11 universities, a fact he found ways to mention in every third lecture. He wore the same 3 blazers on rotation and kept a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a former Olympic coaching staff on the shelf behind his desk, positioned so it was always visible during office hours. Jo noticed him noticing her the first day. Not in a way she couldn't handle. She'd been noticed in far more dangerous ways than that, but in a specific way. The kind of noticing that is really an assessment, a categorization, a filing away. She saw him look at her enrollment paperwork when he thought she was still finding her seat. Saw him glance at her age, her transfer status, the abbreviated version of her prior experience that the university's system listed as simply federal service. Saw something settle in his expression that she recognized immediately because she'd seen it before. Not often, but enough. He'd already decided what she was. The first few weeks, he was merely dismissive. He didn't call on her when her hand was up. He referred to her contributions in discussion as interesting, in the tone that professors use when they mean the opposite. He assigned her to the group project with the 2 weakest students in the seminar, which she understood was not an accident. She did the work. All of it. Didn't complain. Then in week 4, he handed back the first major assessment, a 40-page research analysis on injury prevention protocols. And Jo's paper came back with a 71. She looked at it, read through his comments, looked at it again. The comments didn't match the grade. The feedback was generic. The criticisms he'd written in the margins were addressed explicitly in sections he had apparently not read, or had read and disregarded. She'd seen the A papers from students who sat in the front row because they passed them around, and she had read them carefully. She knew what she'd submitted. She knew what those papers were. She went to his office hours. Dr. Marsh. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. "I'd like to talk about my paper." He looked up from his laptop. Took a moment. "Miss Mwangi, I read your comments." She put the paper on the desk between them. "I addressed the protocol comparison issue on pages 22 through 26. The point about sample size limitations appears in my methodology footnotes. I'm not seeing how the grade reflects the content." He leaned back, folded his hands. "The grade reflects my professional assessment of the work. Then I'd like to understand the professional assessment." She kept her voice completely level. She was very good at this. Specifically, which sections didn't meet the standard. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the paper, flipped through it in a way that made clear he was performing consideration rather than actually reviewing it, and set it back down. "Your analysis lacks rigor in the comparative framework," he said. "The work reads as someone who has practical experience but is not yet comfortable operating at the theoretical level this seminar requires." Page 14 through 19 is the comparative framework, Jo said. "I used Kramer's 2009 model and cross-referenced it with the revised ISO standards from 2018. Is there a specific methodological issue with that approach? He paused, just for a second. The issue, he said carefully, is that practical background can sometimes create blind spots. You have certain fixed assumptions based on your field experience that are limiting your ability to engage with the academic literature on its own terms. Jo looked at him. She understood exactly what he had just said and what he had meant by it. She stood up, picked up her paper, and left. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She walked out of Marsh's office, went to the library, and spent the next 4 hours reading every paper he had published in the last decade. She came back the following Tuesday with a 9-page written response to his grade, citing his own published work as the methodological framework for her analysis. She submitted it to him by email with the department chair CC'd. She did not ask for anything. She simply documented. Marsh didn't change the grade. But 3 things happened in the following 2 weeks. First, her next submitted assignment came back with a 94 and no offense. Second, she noticed that Marsh stopped making eye contact with her in seminar, not the avoiding kind, but the recalibrating kind, the kind that meant something had shifted. Third, the department's graduate coordinator reached out to ask if she'd be interested in presenting at the spring colloquium. She said yes. The colloquium was a mid-April event, held in the department's main lecture hall, attended by faculty, graduate students, and a handful of invited professionals from adjacent fields. Jo was one of 4 presenters. She was the only one who wasn't in her 3rd or 4th year of graduate study. She was also the only one whose presentation had been submitted as a written paper first and accepted, on the merits before anyone attached a name to it. A process the coordinator had quietly implemented the previous year to address a documented pattern in acceptance rates. The paper was called Field-Derived Protocols and Their Empirical Validity, a re-examination of the theory-practice gap in high-stress human performance assessment. 18 pages, 47 citations, 3 original data models. Marsh was on the panel. He had no choice. It was a departmental event, and he was a senior faculty member. He sat at the end of the table in his Thursday blazer, and he did not look comfortable. Jo stood at the front of the room, and she was not nervous. She had been nervous in rooms where the consequences were very different from a bad grade. She had long since learned to separate the feeling from the function. She set up her slides, checked her notes once, and began. She spoke for 22 minutes. She laid out the argument clearly, with evidence, with the kind of structural precision that came from years of writing operational reports where ambiguity cost people something real. She addressed the theory-practice gap directly and without apology, using data she had collected herself during a pilot study she'd run with 8 other student-athletes in the department over the previous 6 weeks. She had cleared the study with the IRB. She had the numbers. When she finished, there was a moment before the applause that was quieter than silence, the kind of pause that happens when a room is recalibrating. Then Dr. Lenny Shaw, a physiologist who'd been at the university for 30 years and was known for saying very little and meaning all of it, started clapping slowly. Then the room followed. The Q&A lasted 35 minutes. Questions came from faculty she hadn't met, from graduate students taking notes on their phones, from a researcher from the NIH who happened to be in the audience and handed her a business card afterward. Every question was serious. She answered every one of them. Marsh asked one question. It was about sample size. It was the same comment he'd written in the margin of her paper. She answered it the same way she'd answered it in footnote 7, calmly, precisely, by name. As I addressed in the methodology section, she said, the sample size reflects the constraints of a 6-week pilot time frame. The models are designed to scale. If you'd like, I can walk through the scaling projections. She looked at him without expression. Or, we can moved on. After the colloquium, she went to the parking lot and sat in her car for a little while. Not because she was overwhelmed. Because it was quiet, and she had learned to value quiet in ways she hadn't before, and she wanted a moment before the rest of the day started up again. Her phone buzzed. It was Ameka, a photo of his daughter, her niece, Adeze, who was 2.5 and had recently discovered that shoes could be used as projectile weapons, sitting in a cardboard box with a very serious expression. Joe laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. She texted back a series of emojis that made no grammatical sense and started the car. There's a thing that happens when you grow up being told, in 100 different ways, what you are and what you aren't, what you're capable of and what you should stop reaching for. Sometimes the people saying it are strangers. Sometimes they're institutions. Sometimes they're just the accumulated weight of every underfunded classroom and every redacted file and every moment someone looked at you and filed you away before you opened your mouth. What Joe had figured out, in 5 years in environments that had no patience for illusion, was that the filing was their limitation, not hers. She never went back to argue with Marsh, never complained to the department about the original grade, buying that documented letter, never brought it up again with anyone. She didn't need to, because the NIH researcher, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who ran a performance science lab in Bethesda, sent a follow-up email 3 weeks after the colloquium offering Joe a paid research position that would begin the following fall. Because Dr. Shaw nominated her thesis proposal without being asked. Because 2 of the graduate students who'd heard her present that April ended up citing her pilot study in their own papers. And because, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, Joe was sitting in the back of the same seminar room where Marsh had handed back her paper with a 71, finishing her notes for the semester, when she heard him tell a new student, a young man who'd just transferred in from community college, who'd apologized twice before asking a question, "There are no shortcuts in this field. Everyone starts from zero." She didn't say anything. She closed her notebook and zipped her bag and walked past Marsh's desk on the way out. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to look at him. She knew exactly where she was going. She'd known since she sat in the back of that government van at 19 and signed her name on a document that didn't officially exist. Some people figure out early that the world has a version of you already picked out, already filed, already decided. The work isn't convincing them to change the file. The work is making the file irrelevant. She pushed open the door, stepped out into the May afternoon, and kept moving.